Hello, History 17B Autumn Quarter 2023. I think that we are about halfway through the quarter, so you might want to check your points. Remember, percentages don't matter, but points do matter, and you want to be somewhere around halfway to the total number of points that you will want. You have probably noticed that my approach to the progressive era so far has been light on presidents and political parties. This was, of course, deliberate because the focus on presidents often makes everything seem very top-down, and the progressive era was far more about human dynamics than it was about presidential power. So now, when we look at presidents, let's consider them one more part of the progressive puzzle rather than being the main driver. The massive alliteration of this lecture title with all the P's, the last piece of the progressive puzzle, political parties, presidents, and policies, believe it or not, it was accidental, but I would be lying if I said that it didn't amuse me. Also, I know the presidents are tiny in this slide here, especially for part one, and hard to read. I'm not going to ask you to name them in order or remember most of the early group specifically at all. Over the period in section 1 here, which would be from Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, to Grover Cleveland's second term, government and business had quite a cozy relationship. We've seen this with the railroads west of the Mississippi, where the U.S. Army fought Native Americans off of their lands, and the federal government that gave a huge percentage of that land to major railroad owners, as well as basically financing the Transcontinental Railroad so that the profits stayed in the hands of railroad owners. We've also seen this in the use of federal power in the suppression of labor movements, especially in the Homestead and Pullman strikes. The era saw 4 Republican presidencies and 2 Democratic ones. Both of those were Grover Cleveland. But this did not amount to much, as neither party ever had enough of a majority in Congress to have its way regularly. This is really the Gilded Age part of things, section 1 here. None of the presidential administrations did much to control businesses or the relationship of the U.S. to an expanding global economy in any way. This is often referred to as laissez-faire economics, a market with little or no government control or regulation. The wealthy class that we've seen made alliances with state and federal officials in order to protect the accumulation of massive profits. John D. Rockefeller Jr., who we saw with the strikes of his miners in Colorado, married the daughter of Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was also the sister of Congressman Richard Aldrich. The Aldriches and their cohort in the Republican Party were known for their ties to business and fierce protection of business interests. In the cartoon on the slide, Nelson Aldrich is the one with the crown and scepter in the center. For the period overseen by the Hayes to Cleveland Round 2 administrations, U.S. political parties functioned mainly by party loyalty. Voters typically made what are called standing decisions, and those are political choices or votes determined mainly based on family history and background rather than on specific issues. The 2 parties, that would be Republican and Democrat, did have overarching positions, but standing decisions tended to assess the value of these by regional history rather than current policies. These souvenirs on the slide are all from Grover Cleveland's campaigns, and they're just to show you the little tchotchkes kind of things that were distributed and worn by people during elections. The Republicans in this particular time period, 1877 to 1897, remember that the party identities and what they stand for is going to change later in the 20th century. So in this time period, the Republicans backed commercial and industrial development with government support of railroads and corporations, and they favored high tariffs to protect domestic manufactured goods from foreign competition. Tariffs here are taxes placed on imported goods. Partly they make money for the government, but what they really do is make imported goods extremely expensive so that people don't buy them in preference to goods made within the US. The so-called native-born white evangelical Protestants among the Republicans favored moral reform law, like prohibition. In response to Catholic schools in northeastern cities, this group also sponsored laws to forbid state aid to Catholic church schools. The Democrats in the same period, 1877 to 1897, advocated low tariffs and consumer prices, and they were opposed to governmental aid to corporations. They were also opposed to most moral reform laws. The Democrats were generally split into two groups, which did not necessarily have much in common besides opposing the Republican Party. The first group was Irish and other Catholic immigrants to large cities, and they opposed laws barring Catholic schools reasonably enough, as well as being largely opposed to prohibition. The second group was the Solid South, and that was 16 southern states in the District of Columbia, which voted for the Democratic candidate in presidential elections, all of them, from Reconstruction to World War I. This vote was based on the disenfranchisement of Black voters, as well as any Native Americans and Chinese in the South, although those were much lower populations. And they disenfranchised Black voters, as you know, or non-white voters, through poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright threats and intimidation. Elections did not look like they do now. There were no printed ballots. Instead, there were brightly colored slips of paper filled out by hand and given to party organizers at the polls. The parties had big parades with bands and lots of campaign souvenirs like you saw in the earlier slide. In my mind, it seems more like the festivities surrounding major sports games with team loyalties based on habit more than anything else. You will notice that most of this held for the eastern half of the US. Remember back when the North and South were hoping for Western states to side with them in culture and economy? Well, the Western states had their own issues, and neither the Democrats nor the Republicans of the era were particularly interested in the problems of Western farmers. The railroads basically set the rules for shipping goods, as well as creating grain monopolies that destroyed smaller farmers and businesses through methods like pooling rebates and lower rates for long-distance transportation. Pooling was a system of agreements between different railroads to set rates higher than they would be if there were market competition among different railroad lines. Rebates were money given back to shippers who used a particular railroad line exclusively, basically giving lower rates to large agricultural companies who formed an association with a particular railroad company. Lower rates for long-distance shipping helped larger companies because large agricultural companies tended to supply the eastern U.S. Small farmers and businesses generally distributed their goods more locally, thus having to pay a higher rate on the railroads than the big businesses. Eastern capital and non-resident investors meant that investments in Western and Midwestern buildings, slaughterhouses, breweries, railroads, telegraphs, and mines paid off for wealthy men in the eastern U.S., siphoning away profits from folks west of the Mississippi. This lent to the development of what are called deflationary spirals. And I put up an image of this as well as a definition on the slide. A deflationary spiral is a debt deflation cycle that occurs when falling prices from a reduced money supply cause farmers and other producers to be unable to pay back loans from banks and other creditors. This results in bankruptcies and job loss, which in turn reduces purchasing power, which further reduces prices, so that items will sell at all, which keeps the cycle going. So I'm sure you can see this is linked into the boom bust cycles, but this is also a particular issue with the West with a lack of hard money supply. Farmers did what everyone else in the Progressive Era was doing and formed organizations. In this case, these were cooperative organizations between smaller farmers that allowed them to combine their goods so that together they could act like a large company. Larger businesses tried to block these by calling the co-ops socialism, one of those scary European political economic ideas. Nonetheless, the cooperative organizations held up for the most part. The first of these to be well known was the National Grange of the Order of Patrons of Husbandry, usually just called the Grange. And this group challenged owners of railroads and grain elevators by pooling farmers' harvests and holding out for higher prices. The Grange also pressured state legislatures to pass laws regulating railroads and grain elevators to keep prices fair. I think grain elevator is fairly obvious, but it's a place where grain could be stored close to railroad tracks where it would then be transported. The Grange eventually morphed into the most outspoken advocate for farmers, the Farmers Alliance. For the Farmers Alliance, local chapters created cooperatives that sold grain and purchased supplies in bulk to save money for their members. So once again, basically acting like a larger single corporation. The Farmers Alliance also formed small banks to ensure farmers' control over their money. Just to remind you, in case it slipped your mind, anybody could form a bank at that time. The Farmers Alliance saw to the particular concerns of different groups by forming local chapters centered on one group, such as the Colored Farmers Alliance and the Women's Alliance. And the Farmers Alliance pressured the federal government, resulting in the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, which created the first federal regulatory agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission. In this Gilded Age section of our Module C time period, both major political parties claimed to support industrial workers. But those workers saw what we have seen in earlier lectures, the federal government putting their weight behind owners in actions such as the Homestead and Pullman strikes. Samuel Gompers, head of the AFL, said that he would only back one party over the other if they would pledge that government, including the courts, would not interfere with unions' efforts to organize workers. Neither party agreed to that, so the unions did not back either party. At the national level, this didn't make a real difference, but the mayoral election of 1886 in New York City showed interesting potential, at least for a hot minute. One Henry George, you see him there on the left, a journalist, wrote a book calling for a single tax, and you'll see single tax in things on the Progressive Era. Basically, this was a heavy tax on land ownership, and it was popular with workers across the world, including China, Australia, and Ireland. George ran for the mayor of New York City under the United Labor Party, a third party. In addition to industrial workers, Henry George earned the support of the Farmers Alliance and the liberal wing of the WCTU. Business Republicans and urban Democrats who benefited from the two-party system joined forces to find a candidate to defeat George. And they managed to win, but by a very narrow margin. That would be Abram Hewitt there. The distant third place finisher in that mayoral election was Theodore Roosevelt, who we shall be seeing again in a bit. Focusing on the Cleveland back and forth in the latter half of this section, one period, we start to see the two main political parties trying to figure out how to please enough different groups to win the votes for the presidency. Before we go on, however, let's take a quick look at the way that U.S. money worked at the end end of the 19th century. The gold standard is a monetary system in which countries' money, coins, paper bills, so on, is linked in value directly to the value of gold. And the country's government sets a fixed price for buying and selling gold. In somewhat more straightforward terms, the gold standard meant that you could take your money to the government and they would be able to produce a chunk of gold of equivalent value. Backing money with gold means that the country actually has to have the gold if called upon. So at the time, the US stockpiled gold at Fort Knox. And yes, it looks like that. And yes, Fort Knox up there on the upper right still exists. In Grover Cleveland's first term, Republicans in the Northeast, remember based in industrial production, were alarmed by the fact that Cleveland kept pressing to lower tariffs as an almost single-minded cause. These Northeastern industrialists rallied to make certain that Cleveland was defeated in the election of 1888, replacing him with former Civil War General Benjamin Harrison. Although if you look closely at the slide, you will see that Cleveland won the popular vote. But under Harrison, the Republicans went all in on the agenda of Protestant piety, so anti-vice campaigns of all kinds, which tended to alienate most Americans. Republicans took the hint and decided to focus on economic issues rather than cultural control in 1890. Republicans got the Tariff of 1890 through Congress. It's also called the McKinley Tariff for the congressman who backed it, and we will see him again later too. This tariff meant reduction in competition from cheap imported goods, which pleased some farmers, along with those who relied on industrial production for their living. But the Tariff of 1890 also required importers to send gold to the U.S. Treasury to pay importation fees. This is where we get to the gold standard bit. When lenders called in loans from Western farmers, they often wanted solid coin to be certain of the payment, no computer transfer. And with the tariff, that coin was becoming increasingly scarce. The Republicans tried three somewhat ham-handed and insincere efforts to win over parts of the American electorate. So they were aiming for individual parts of the electorate rather than having a cohesive strategy that hung together well. The first of these was the Dependent and Disability Pension Act. This authorized pensions for disabled veterans and widows of Union soldiers from the Civil War. By 1900, 40% of the federal budget went to pensions. The combined tariff pension strategy backfired by resulting in increasing prices for consumers, many of whom were in that white middle-class voting bloc that we were talking about a couple of lectures ago. Republicans tried to get anti-big business credibility with the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Ostensibly, this broke up monopolies, and you often see it covered that way. But it was weak when it came to enforcement and vague in wording, meaning that the first cases brought to court went in favor of the monopolies. So the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was more a gesture than any actual change. So the Republicans scotch-taped on one more attempt to get voter support with the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. This required the federal government to purchase extraordinary amounts of silver from Western mines and issue bonds, which could then be paid back with the bondholder's choice of gold or silver. Most silver miners chose the more valuable gold, further reducing available supplies. Folks who owned silver mines in Nevada, Colorado, and Montana loved this. Everyone else, not so much. The result was one of the more successful third parties of the 20th century, the People's or Populist Party, formed by a coalition of the Grange, the Farmers Alliance, Union Labor Party, and other smaller groups who felt, rather justifiably, that neither major political party actually listened to them and paid attention to their on-the-ground needs. Representatives of the Populist Party met in Omaha, Nebraska in July of 1892. A platform is the set of issues that a party metaphorically stands on. So each issue is referred to as a plank in the platform. Since the Populists met in Omaha, their set of favored reforms was called the Omaha Platform. You can read the text of the actual platform as a primary source on YA, but leaving out smaller things like support for military pensions, it boiled down to the request for a graduated income tax by which the wealthy would pay more for the care and upkeep of the nation than the poor, direct election of senators by voters rather than state legislatures, secret ballots, public ownership, meaning being run by the federal government, of necessary services like railroads, telegraph, and postal service, an 8-hour workday, free silver, which meant basing the currency on both gold and silver, making more currency in circulation, and on immigration restrictions. Although women did not yet have the national vote, they could vote in some local or state elections, often school board elections. But many women campaigned visibly for the Populist Party, offending the sensibilities or raising the fear of change, depending on how you view it, of moral conservatives. Remember, conserve means to keep unchanged. And these people whose power and status was held up by the status quo were uncomfortable with the chance that that might change. For a third party, the Populist Party did okay in the 1892 elections. They got 11 seats in the U.S. Congress, a few governorships, majorities in the state legislatures of Kansas, Nebraska, and North Carolina, and finally, they actually managed to get 22 electoral votes for president. Cleveland won the election of 1892, so that was his second term, but not consecutive. Then came 1893, and you've heard about the Panic of 1893. I am not exactly crying for Cleveland. This would be Grover Cleveland, not the city. But the Panic of 1893 basically was a disaster to his second presidency. Some of the consequences of the Panic of 1893 you've already heard about. But to summarize them here, it was a failure of smaller railroads, banks, and businesses accompanied by massive unemployment. In 1894, so-called armies of unemployed workers, and I won't talk specifically about Coxey's army, but you can read about it in Yop and other places. These unemployed workers marched on Washington, D.C., demanding that the federal government alleviate unemployment with public works projects and federal jobs. The Panic of 1893 resulted in major labor unrest, and a rush of bondholders wanting to redeem their notes for gold, which banks were not going to be able to fulfill in that bulk. Grover Cleveland, president, turned to big business for solutions, including turning to financier J.P. Morgan for the immediate loan of gold to the federal government with the promise of repayment in the form of federal bonds with 4% interest. The optics of this were not great. First, it showed how very wealthy and powerful folks like Morgan had become at everyone else's expense. Morgan basically used his vast fortune to increase his vast fortune at the expense of everyone else. It made it screamingly clear how much power folks like J.P. Morgan exercised over the U.S. government. When it came to the election of 1896, Democrats dropped Grover Cleveland like a hot potato. Democrats rejected pro-business policies and created a watered-down version of the populist platform. They nominated William Jennings Bryan, who called for unlimited silver coinage. You can find his famous Cross of Gold speech online, and Yawp has a whole section on Bryan. We've already seen that the Republicans were scrambling to figure out which voting bloc they should try to collect. Republicans nominated William McKinley, who was backed by wealthy businessmen. McKinley got support from part of the middle class that left the Democratic Party because they figured that Bryan's monetary policy would result in massive inflation. Bryan lost the Eastern working class for the same reason. Additionally, Bryan read as thoroughly evangelical, which made Catholic and Jewish Americans uneasy. As you see, McKinley won, and that takes us to the next part of this lecture. McKinley was elected to 2 terms, but was assassinated before he could fulfill the 2nd term. I will be coming back to that, but I want to address events in McKinley's full 1st term on their own. This is largely because during McKinley's 1st term, the U.S. moved on from colonizing North America to overseas imperial conquest. McKinley was lucky to have a fairly good economy during his 1st term, and consolidation of the continental U.S. was largely, although not entirely, completed. On the other hand, even before McKinley's term, the U.S. production in both farm and industry started outgrowing demand of the U.S. alone. While the U.S. was busy displacing Native Americans and forcibly colonizing the center of North America, white Americans distanced themselves from European imperialism. If you dig into this logically, it doesn't make much sense. But if you view it as a growing idea of American exceptionalism, we're not like those evil Europeans, as a basis for nationalism, then it works. Generally speaking, before the late 1890s, the U.S. avoided political takeover in other regions outside of North America. But the U.S. had no problem with vigorously pursuing foreign markets, whether they were welcome or not. When it came to supposedly civilized, meaning with lots of money to invest, European nations, American entrepreneurs borrowed heavily from British banks, while wealthy Europeans invested in the industries and railroads of the U.S. Justified with civilization discourse, U.S. businesses pursued markets, resources, and ventures in less wealthy nations, while American missionaries and moral reformers spread over most of the non-European world, seeking converts to Christianity and meek acceptance of supposedly superior Euro-American culture. Wealthy U.S. tourists spent money abroad, but sometimes treated people not from the U.S. and Europe as, at best, curiosities, and at worst, as not fully human. The cartoon here with the octopus is of Standard Oil, but the United Fruit Company was also nicknamed El Pulpo, or the octopus. By 1872, one of the U.S. super wealthy men started building a railroad in Costa Rica and planting bananas to the sides of the tracks. In 1884, the same man, Minor C. Keith, whom we don't often think of with Carnegie, Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan, but probably should. At any rate, in 1884, Keith contracted with the government of Costa Rica to fund their national debt and to lay another 50 miles of railroad track. In return, Keith got an amazing deal. It's nice if you can pay off the national debt of a small country. Keith got full rights to his rail lines for 99 years and was given 800,000 acres of undeveloped land in Costa Rica that would be exempt from taxes for 20 years. and he planted lots more bananas. The United Fruit Company was formed by a merger of miners' banana plantations along with another company in 1899. The resulting large company was based in Boston, so that's where the profits went, but extracted resources from Central America. I'm going to make a very complicated story short here and cut to the big point. United Fruit kept expanding until it was the largest employer in Central America. United Fruit used its power to coerce Caribbean, Central, and South American governments to sign over huge tracts of land that the company cleared to build plantations. United Fruit also controlled railroad transport in Central America and a fleet of ships called the Great White Fleet. I do not make this stuff up. You can see it on the slide. As you can see on the map on the slide, the reach of United Fruit was a little bit like an octopus with tentacles infiltrating everywhere. So that's the story of the U.S. interfering to the south, at least a summary of it. The U.S. also reached west to Asian markets across the Pacific. This is the state of the Pacific in 1897. The Philippines here were in the process of declaring independence from Spain, who had been holding the islands as a colony in their formerly very large empire. Midway Island up here, this teeny thing, has been claimed by the U.S. At this point in time for the map, Hawaii was recognized by the U.S. as an independent nation, not ruled by Hawaiians, whose government was overthrown in 1893, but by American sugar planters. I'm not going to dig into Hawaii deeply, but point out that although at this point the U.S. did not annex or claim Hawaii, American sugar growers had essentially taken over, little like the banana plantations, except here the owners lived on their plantations. Remember that Republicans had pushed through a high tariff on imported goods. The sugar planters wanted Hawaii annexed by the U.S. so that their sugar transported to the U.S. would count as a domestic product with no tariff rather than a foreign product. If we look down here on the lower right corner, we can just see the label for Samoa. Samoa is a group of 14 volcanic islands. Their main appeal is their location, a bit of a stepping stone from either Europe or the US on the way to Asian markets. At the time, ships burned coal, and both Germany and the US wanted Samoa as a coaling station. Both countries sent fleets, and Germany and the US were actually on the brink of war when a typhoon scuttled the fleets of both nations. I kid you not. At the Berlin Conference of 1889, so actually that was before McKinley's presidency, Britain, Germany, and the US split Samoa into a tripartite protectorate. A bit like protection by a mob boss, which is what you see in this cartoon. It's not mob, but Samoa is portrayed as a woman trying to fend off the US, Great Britain, and Germany. In 1899, and now we are into the McKinley section, Britain gave over their part of Samoa, and Germany and the US happily divided the islands between just the two of them. A big issue to the US was having a navy that could keep up with everyone else. Great Britain had the biggest navy in the world at that time. Germany had a sizable navy. Japan's navy was growing large enough that they were actually starting to challenge Russia, and the US government and corporations felt that unless they had a navy that could hold its own against these, the US might lose access to those markets in Asia, into which excess agricultural and industrial products from the US could be exported. The US had it all planned out. They would need a large merchant marine to carry goods and long-range steel battleships to protect the merchant marine ships. The desired huge naval force would need a network of colonies to be used for coaling, making repairs, and obtaining raw materials. And the U.S. would also need a canal bisecting Central America, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific so that ships could stop sailing all the way around South America. The 19th century arms race was on. The US, British, German, and Japanese fleets grew, but the Spanish, who had claimed a gigantic empire in the 1600s, was gradually seeing that empire fall apart in the 1800s. Part of that crumbling empire was Cuba in the Caribbean here, rather close to the US. We've been looking at the reach of American commercial interests spreading outside of the US into Central America, into Hawaii, well before American military forces were sent. US capitalists invested heavily in Cuba's sugar, mining, and tobacco industries. Big US corporations also convinced Cuban planters, so not the laborers, but the plantation owners, to sign over their lands in return for stock or jobs in the big US firms. But also remember that there were tariffs in the US to discourage the competition of foreign goods with US products. As in Hawaii, the firms making money were American, but the products, like sugar, were grown in a foreign country, here Cuba, and had to pay the tariffs. We also know that American corporate owners did not like giving up any money if they could possibly help it. The map you are looking at is the extent of the Spanish Empire at its height, so well before we're looking at now. You know that by our Module C time frame, the US had this bit, Mexico was independent, Central and South America also saw revolutions that overthrew Spanish rule and established independent nations. Spain still had some islands, notably Cuba and the Philippines. You may remember that a few slides ago, when I showed the Pacific, I said that the Philippines were in the process of throwing off Spanish rule. Well, so was Cuba. Spain was absolutely brutal in both the Philippines and in Cuba. This was the era of yellow or sensationalist journalism in the US, and people literally starving right next to the US made good copy with pictures, and it sold papers in the US. This began, as far as the US was concerned, while Cleveland was president. US opinion overall was a completely mixed bag. There were those who were genuinely moved and thought the US should help the Cuban people. And there were those who saw a great opportunity for the US to expand its manifest destiny wings. Under Cleveland, US policymakers feared that a war with Spain would jeopardize American commercial interests in Cuba. And these policymakers did not consider the Cuban people to be advanced, in quotes, enough to govern their own country. In order to avoid official US entanglement, President Cleveland, declared neutrality. Initially, McKinley also went with official neutrality, but when an uptick in resistance and violence threatened US citizens and investments in Cuba, McKinley sent the battleship, the USS Maine, to Havana Harbor. You can see Havana Harbor up here, to be ready to defend American interests if necessary, or at least to loom over everyone as a threat not to mess with Americans. And then on 15 February 1898, the Maine exploded. Recent studies have attributed the explosion to coal dust that ignited in the enclosed space of the ship, but the explosion was a gold mine for Americans who wanted to go to war already, either to annex Cuba or to prove the masculine power of the US. And yes, it was expressed in those gendered terms. Chief among those calling for war was Theodore Roosevelt. the guy who lost the mayor's race for New York City, but would become the city's police commissioner and a governor of New York State, where we saw him when we discussed tenement reform in the last lecture. T. Roosevelt explicitly linked a particular notion of masculinity to American nationalism. One aphorism from him that is carved into the rotunda of the Natural History Museum in New York City reads, "All daring and courage, all iron endurance and misfortune make for a finer, nobler type of manhood." Earlier in his career, with regard to a U.S. dispute with Great Britain, Roosevelt said, "I don't care whether our seacoast cities are bombarded or not. We could take Canada. Personally, I rather hope the fight will come soon. The clamor of the peace faction has convinced me that this country needs a war." When it came to the remnants of the Spanish fleet and empire, Roosevelt said, "It is very difficult for me not to wish a war with Spain, for such a war would result at once in getting a proper navy." He also told the commander of the American fleet near the Philippines to be ready to fight the Spanish fleet there a couple of months before the explosion of the Maine. Finally, when McKinley sought to avert war and was in discussions with Spain, T. Roosevelt publicly commented, "McKinley has not more backbone than a chocolate eclair." There was a great deal of anti-war and anti-imperialist sentiment in the U.S., but Roosevelt had a powerful ally in wanting war and empire. When I introduced yellow journalism, I said that we would come back to the famous example, and here we are. Hearst, owner of the newspapers, quite deliberately sold the story that Spain had sunk the American battleship Maine, although this was made absolutely no sense as an action for Spain, and most investigations at the time suggested that whatever the cause was, it was highly unlikely to have been a deliberate attack. But you can see the screaming headline there, "Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy." Well, what enemies were the U.S. facing there? And then it says, "Assistant Secretary Roosevelt convinced the explosion of the warship was not an accident," despite the fact that it was. Hearst bragged, "Newspapers form and express public opinion. They suggest and control legislation. They declare wars," the newspapers. "They punish criminals, especially the powerful. The newspapers control the nation." And once war was declared with Spain, Hearst asked his readers, "How do you like the journal's war?" T. Roosevelt and Hearst got their way. The one concession that the anti-war and anti-imperialism contingent got was the Teller Amendment, stating that the United States did not intend to annex Cuba, and even getting that was a difficult fight. For his part, once war was inevitable, T. Roosevelt withdrew from the Navy Department, ordered a nice blue lieutenant colonel's uniform from Brooks Brothers, and assumed deputy command of the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, which he named the Rough Riders, and you may have heard of the Rough Riders. The regiment's commander under Roosevelt was T. Roosevelt's close friend, Colonel Leonard Wood, a former frontier military surgeon and Indian fighter. I have given you the chapter from Dunbar Ortiz's book for this module because I want you to connect U.S. imperialism on the North American continent with the deliberate projection of American power overseas. Americans were deeply divided when it came to what was so obviously imperialism at this point. Somehow they could deny it was imperialism. It was just manifest destiny in North America. But when it came to overseas takings, then it made the US look a little bit too much like those evil Europeans. T. Roosevelt, however, was all about image, both for himself and for the nation, and pretty much the same image for both of a very narrow take on aggressive masculinity. And you can see his reference to white American cowboys and Indians frontier mythology in the image that he deliberately projected. So this is that snazzy uniform that he ordered, and this is the way that he was portrayed in the press. T. Roosevelt made certain that he had newspaper reporters along to write stories for popular American audiences on the heroism of his Rough Riders, which the journalists dutifully did. In fact, T. Roosevelt and the Rough Riders tend to get almost sole credit in popular history for winning the Battle of San Juan or Kettle Hill. You might be forgiven for not realizing that there were a number of other troops there, including the 24th and 25th Infantry and the 9th and 10th Cavalry, all four of which were all Black units, often called Buffalo Soldiers. You notice that they are missing from the official photo op on the left here. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Teddy Roosevelt raved about their bravery. But once he got back to the US and started honing his political image with aspirations for the presidency, he said Negro troops were shirkers in their duties and would only go so far as they were led by white officers. Not all of them were led by white officers. One of the members of the 10th Cavalry responded, you see the quote on the right, his, meaning Roosevelt's statement was uncalled for and uncharitable. And considering the moral and physical effect the advance of the 10th Cavalry had in weakening the forces opposed to the colonel's regiment, both at Las Guasimas, which I didn't talk about, and San Juan Hill, altogether ungrateful and has done us an immeasurable harm. T. Roosevelt went to Harvard. He was a son of an extremely wealthy family. His, quote, strenuous life image was very carefully crafted. As one professor at Harvard in the early 20th century noted, the Spanish-American War promoted T. Roosevelt from a colonelcy to the presidency. We will pick up that story in part 2 of this lecture, but before we leave part 1 here, let's take a look at America's new overseas empire. At the end of the Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam became U.S. dependencies. Congress's war resolution had renounced U.S. claims to Cuba, but the island remained under U.S. military rule for more than 3 years, and the U.S. retained up to this day a large base at Guantanamo. And yes, if you've heard of prisoners at Guantanamo, it is that Guantanamo. Expansionist zeal had led Congress to annex Hawaii in July. And in 1899, the United States and Germany would divide the archipelago of Samoa. America was now a major stakeholder in the Far East. The US was not quite a world power yet, but it was definitely maneuvering to become one. This on the slide is an enlargement from the Pacific slide that you saw before. It reminds us that in 1896, nationalists in the Philippines sought to throw off Spanish rule. So by the end of the Spanish-American War, Filipinos had been fighting for independence for a couple of years already. Spain agreed to surrender, but only to the US, not to the Filipino nationalists. And while there was pushback from parts of the American populace and huge pushback from the Filipinos, the US government decided that Filipinos would be incapable, that's a quote, incapable of governing themselves. And the US held onto the Philippines. America's acquisition of the Philippines was a preemptive move against Russia, Germany, and other European powers with colonial aims in the Far East, particularly China and Japan. The Philippine port of Manila was an established center for trade between the so-called West with Japan and China. I will leave us here and pick up the story again in part 2. As usual, the key points and coda will be at the end of the full lecture.